Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Is the world looking for a whole new order with less America in it? Let's get to the bottom line. Very soon, we're going to be looking at the Ukraine war in terms of years and not months. Despite losses here and there on the battlefield, the way Russia sees it, this is a vital war, and it doesn't matter how long it lasts. The alternative to Moscow is much worse. That would be living under the thumb of NATO and the United States and under their rules. Chinese power is bursting at the seams as Beijing attempts to widen its sphere of influence globally. When U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping met last month, they said they were looking for ways to coexist, despite their many disagreements. So tensions, well, they're diminished for now. But are we witnessing a major shift toward a new world order, one that's not fully dominated by the United States? And what would that look like? Today, we're talking with one of America's leading foreign policy thinkers and writers, Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations and a former official at the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon. Richard, it's always an honor to talk to you, but I just want to get some straight talk from, one of the smartest people in world affairs I know. Are we at the end of one chapter of American engagement in the world and the beginning of another chapter? What are your thoughts?
The short answer is yes, in part for reasons that are not directly about America, but they're simply about the world. There's two things that are going on that delineate this moment, Steve. One is the reemergence of intense great power rivalry. Many thought that had been put to bed with the end of the Cold War. Now the United States finds itself dealing with Russia, with China, and with two hostile medium powers, North Korea and Iran. And then secondly, we live in an age that, before this century's out, could ultimately come to be defined by these global challenges. We're just at hopefully the tail end of an infectious disease pandemic, but climate change obviously is happening and is going to happen with ever greater effects as this century unfolds. And then thirdly, there are things that are about us. We have changed in fundamental ways as a country, as a society. There's no longer a consensus about American foreign policy. Indeed, there's not a consensus about anything really anymore in the United States. We're far more divided than we ever were, certainly in modern times. So what I think defines this era is this combination of these two global changes, geopolitical and global challenges, and then all against the backdrop of the United States. And at the risk of sounding boastful, we're not just any other country. We've played an outsized role in the world. I would like to think for better. Others may disagree, but I would say for better. But in any case, we played an outsized role for 3/4 of a century. And I'm not sure we're prepared to do it with the scale or consistency that we've done it now for 75 years.
I was recently at a Veterans Day parade in a small town in America. And for our global viewers, Veterans Day is a big deal here. You often have veterans who fought in wars, in America's wars in the past. And I was looking at those veterans from the Korean War, from World War II, and there are not going to be many of them around. There are not many around anymore. And it just, when you talk about America being that sculptor of the world and being deeply engaged, and there being a sense that our being involved not only helped others, but it helped the United States as well. Are we going through a generational phase where there's now just not much memory of the benefits of being globally engaged? And is that what's going on, that younger generations just don't understand how vital it is to be engaged in global affairs?
I think to some extent that's true. I mean, think about it. Even something like the war in Ukraine is a long ways away. It doesn't affect the daily lives of Americans. In some ways, the last things to affect us in the way of foreign policy directly was 9/11. That's more than 2 decades ago now. And the wars in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, as costly as they were fought by an all-volunteer force. So large elements of this society didn't necessarily feel them directly. And throughout all of this, domestic life went on pretty much unchanged. I'd also add to this, Steve, is the reality that we don't teach these issues in schools. You can graduate from the Harvards or Yales or Stanfords and essentially be, I'll use a harsh word here, illiterate, uninformed about much of what goes on in the world. Our news media doesn't cover it nearly as thoroughly as it did when you and I were growing up. back in the dark ages. And you add all this up, and I think you have an American citizenry which is less aware of what is going on in the world and less understanding of the two-way connections between how the world affects us and how we in turn affect the world.
You know, you've been at the helm of the Council on Foreign Relations for 20 years, and perhaps this is an unfair question, but you know nearly everybody that matters in foreign affairs, not only in the latest generation, but previous ones. And I guess one of the things I've been wondering is, do we have Richard Holbrooks around? Do we have Dean Achesons around? Do we have, Kissingers and others, that were folks that you knew well and seem to be aware that the institutional global contract that America was making through engagement in the world, that we had people that could sculpt that? And I'm just interested in a candid assessment on whether that kind of crowd still exists, not only in the Biden administration, but just generally in the foreign affairs world.
I'm going to fight your question a little bit. People like Henry Kissinger, Dean Acheson, they're once every 50 years, once a century kind of individuals, quite extraordinary. George Marshall might be another one. I think it's now, though, less that we don't have remarkable individuals. We have some perfectly capable individuals, either in government or who could come into government. I'm not sure, though, that the best people are attracted as much to government as they used to be. We've denigrated public service. I also think it can be more difficult to mobilize the American people. It circles back to the conversation we were just having. I think earlier people like the Achesons or the Kissingers, they didn't have to rally the American people quite as much around the proposition that the world matters. I think now you've got a much stronger sense that whatever it is we do in the world comes at the expense of what we ought to be doing here at home. I don't think a lot of people intuit that national security is really a two-sided coin with things international and things domestic. So I think the challenge of leading has become more difficult. And I think that goes beyond the character traits or the talents of this or that individual.
We're now seeing, after the midterm elections in the United States, things are revving up for the 2024 presidential election. We know President Trump has thrown his hat back in the ring. There are a lot of other Republicans that look like they're going to, potentially challenge him for that. But I think the big question is whether or not your gut feeling tells you that one of the litmus tests is going to be whether isolationism is on the ticket again. And I'm trying not to be crude about the word isolationism. It's very hard for the United States to withdraw from all the trappings of engagement. But there's a kind of drift where you stop caring about the world as much and you start making decisions, well, we've got to help something in our locality as opposed to Kiev because of trade-offs there. And I'm just interested in whether or not you fear a creeping isolationism in American politics.
Well, I see it. I see it in both parties. You see it with the progressives on the left. You see it with the extreme right of the Republican Party. It's not clear to me, though, that in either party, people of that philosophy or orientation hold the preponderance of power. So it's quite possible in 2024 we're going to have people who are more representative of the moderate, more part of the spectrum, representing more continuity than change. Look, I can't say that with 100% confidence. One of the lessons I've learned over the last few years is I can't say anything with 100% confidence anymore. But I wouldn't assume anytime soon that the neo-isolationists or people who have what you might call a narrow or pinched view of America's relationship with the world, I don't think they're yet dominant in our politics.
One of the big questions going on right now is the Ukraine war. I mean, and obviously I've read your views on Ukraine. I also read them on Afghanistan, in which the hope in Washington, D.C. anyway, was that Afghan forces would be resilient and would hold longer. Turned out not to be the case. The general assessment of President Zelensky then in Ukraine is it would fall fast. And I guess part of this is, whether or not we're reading the terrain quickly, and how, for our viewers, what does Ukraine mean for the United States and for Western powers right now? Is this a defining challenge, or is it something that can, that we could walk away from?
I don't see us walking away from it. I do think it's defining. I think it's been the defining foreign policy challenge of the Biden presidency. I would add that I think President Biden and his team have met it quite well. Most of what they've done, I think, deserves plaudits, deserves applause. And I don't see us walking away from it. There's a majority in both parties that will support this standing up to blatant Russian aggression and brutality. It's possible down the road there can and will be some differences over the scale of American help or over this or that peace proposal. But the lion's share of those Americans who are focused on this war, I think, are very much behind the direction of this president, which is an alliance first, leaning forward approach. That wasn't the case in Afghanistan. I would just say there I wasn't so supportive of what we did. And I would say I actually think the Afghans might have been more resilient had the United States been willing to stay, even in relatively small numbers. The president decided otherwise. We left. But I would think for your viewers, it's wrong to read into Afghanistan as somehow a model or template for all American foreign policy. This president and several people around him had very strong views that Afghanistan was not a place for the United States to continue investing. But I think he's made it clear that he is willing to invest in Ukraine, and he is willing to invest, say, in Taiwan in pushing back against China.
Richard, you once had a job that I've told people would be my favorite job in government if it were to be offered. It never has been, folks, which is the policy planning director at the State Department, which, very well-known George Kennan once held. He wrote a famous article on what Mr. X would do under the name Mr. X about Soviet containment. You wrote very bold papers, bold ideas from that seat. And I'm just sort of interested that if you were to kind of take your Council on Foreign Relations hat off, go back into thinking in big ways of State Department memos, et cetera, what would be some of the ideas that you think would be worth considering about kind of keeping America in the game, or some of the trade-offs perhaps with China? I'm interested in that kind of Mr. X article today as applied to today, and what ought to be on the radar screens of people who do care about the stability and course of American engagement in the world.
Well, with Russia and China, we can't do whatever it is we want to do unilaterally. So I would have an alliance-first approach. It would deal with diplomacy. It would deal with military contingency planning, also economic contingency planning. I think we need to put into place potential sanctions against China. Not that I want to trigger them, but I want China to know that any use of force against Taiwan would be extraordinarily costly for it. I think we need to build coalitions of what I would call, Steve, the like-minded. We're never going to deal with global problems effectively if we think of multilateralism as resembling the UN General Assembly. We just had the 27th failure of global attempts to deal with climate change. It's not going to change with the 28th or 29th or 30th. What we need to do is get smaller groupings of countries that are prepared to work together, perhaps with companies, perhaps with other organizations, to deal with these global challenges. I would also spend more time speaking to Americans, going back to our conversation about why the world matters, why what it is we spend and invest in the world is not a form of philanthropy, but it's a form of self-interest. I think we have to draw those connections. So there's lots I would do. I'd say one other thing. I would also introduce a degree of modesty. I don't think the purpose of American foreign policy can or should be to transform the world. Don't get me wrong. I would love to see more people around the world, in Russia, in China, in North Korea, in Iran, living in democracy. Maybe they will get there. But if they get there, they're going to get there largely through their own devices, on their own feet. It's not going to be because the United States has a foreign policy of promoting democratic transformations using force, as we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think we need to have a degree of modesty. The principal focus of our foreign policy should be on the foreign policies of others. That's where I think we can have the greatest effect. We can stand up and should stand up for greater freedom in places like Iran. We should help those people where and how we can with what tools are relevant. But again, the first order of American foreign policy needs to be to shape the external behavior of other countries around the world.
How do you've just mentioned Iran, but also China, and right now we see in China, considering we almost see no domestic upheaval, but significant protests against the government over one COVID policy. We've seen protests calling for an end to one-party rule. It's hard to scale whether these are large or small. They're just different than what we've seen. And I see a lot of American commentators saying, hey, let's be with the protesters. You know, they want to be like America. And I'm like, wait, I don't see it that way. I'd just be interested in what counsel you have when you see protests in a place like China and you're sitting in Washington, D.C. as a policymaker. What are the limits of our enthusiasms or involvement in that kind of domestic situation inside China?
I think we have to observe the Hippocratic principle of first doing no harm. These protests did not begin because of American foreign policy. They initiated because of failed Chinese COVID policy, because of a slowing Chinese economy, because of large-scale unemployment. It's a long list. And a leadership in China that is so consolidated power can't blame anybody else. So I don't think we ought to give them targets to blame. We're not going to be able to fundamentally alter the course. So there I would largely opt for restraint where we can get information in. If information is shut down, that would be helpful. I think we need to speak about our respect and defense of human rights. But ultimately, the Chinese are going to have to shape their own future. And we've also got to deal with them on other issues. We've got to deal with China on Ukraine, on North Korea, and so forth. So we have to understand that we still have the obligation to conduct foreign policy, even against this backdrop.
Do you think that President Biden and Xi Jinping's meeting in Bali on the edge of the recent G20 meeting was a constructive one? It seemed to me that tensions diminished a bit.
I think so. I think both sides had a certain stake in that, the Chinese in particular. They needed to lower the temperature. I think they were quite taken aback by how robust the American response was with its partners in Europe to Ukraine and to Russia. I think they've noticed some of the new alignments we have in the Indo-Pacific. Again, I think they took notice there. The new export controls we've introduced. I think the Chinese wanted to calm things down, and I think the fact that we've reintroduced a degree of diplomacy, we've institutionalized some meetings, I think is healthy. I'm realistic in my expectations. This isn't we're not talking breakthroughs. We're not talking a new era, but sometimes in foreign policy, you content yourself not so much with what you can achieve, but with what you can avoid. And I think the priority has to be to avoid direct Chinese help of Russia in Ukraine, and even more to avoid a war with China over Taiwan.
You know, I want to tell our audience that Richard Haass has authored many, many books, and I think I've read every word of all of those books, along the way. And they're really like conversations with people. They're not weighty in a sense that you lose your folks. You're having a conversation about the importance of foreign policy. And I think one of the themes which we were getting at a little bit in our earlier discussion, but it was also part of the national security strategy that was issued by the Biden White House, was that, the inside of America, what's going on here, the economic health of the country, the way a certain group of people are feeling demeaned by circumstances matters, because it makes it very hard to be engaged in affairs that are outside. And I'm just interested in your insights, both running the Council on Foreign Relations, but in your book tours, what resonates with Americans that may not already be inclined to be globally engaged? What are the kinds of things you think that we all should be looking at in terms of, changing that equation for many people who look at this as irrelevant to their lives?
I think you have to connect the dots. People in America, they have lives, they have families, and I think there is a preference that foreign policy is something that others handle. Americans get most interested in foreign policy, unfortunately, when we're at war and when Americans are paying a price, human price for that war or economic price for that war. But I think there's many other issues they would understand. They supported the Cold War, even though it remained cold. I think there's obviously support to deal with terrorism abroad. I think we've got to do a better job of making the argument for confronting climate change. I don't think the administration did, for example, a very good job at selling the importance of vaccinating much of the world against COVID-19. Again, not simply because it was a good or right thing to do for them, but also because it was a smart thing to do for ourselves. Again, I come back to this idea that you've got to constantly connect dots and not assume that people see the payoff, see how what happens over there doesn't stay there. One way or another, it'll get on the highway of globalization and come here and affect us. And I just wouldn't assume that people see those connections. One other thing we should constantly point out is the cost of doing this is not prohibitive. What we now spend on defense, as large as it is, Steve, is what? Roughly half the level as a percentage of our gross domestic product that we spent during the Cold War. And during the Cold War, we showed we could succeed at foreign policy and succeed at nation building here at home. And I think we have to be prepared to make the same argument today.
Thank you. And just real quick, finally, Richard, I'm interested in the Middle East as well. And one of the measures of whether America is perceived to be strong or weak is not by looking just at the rivals, but also looking at the allies. And there was this Saudi OPEC decision, essentially to cut production. And if you go to the Middle East today and you ask people honestly, they see Russia as more ascendant than the United States. What do we have to do to turn that around?
Well, good luck in turning to Russia if Iran gets even closer to nuclear weapons. Good luck in turning to Russia if you want to see peace brokered elsewhere in the Middle East. Russia has its hands full with this war of choice. It started in Ukraine. Its own society is turning against its government. It's in many ways a failed state with oil and with missiles. I don't think Russia holds out much of a path or a hope for the Middle East. Again, I'm not saying we're perfect, but I still think the United States is in a unique position to offer security and economic development, as well as the hope of greater political opportunity to the countries and peoples of the Middle East. I don't think Russia's a serious alternative. I also, for that matter, don't think China's a serious alternative. It too has its hands full with its own domestic inbox.
One last quick one. What would you say, looking back in hindsight, may have been America's biggest mistake that it made, that had it taken a different course, say with Russia and NATO or something of that sort, we might not be in the situation we are today?
I'm not sure anyone can answer that with confidence. We don't know how much of this was not reactive, but was simply Mr. Putin waking up and assessing this was something he could accomplish at minimal cost, given the way he viewed the United States, Europe, Ukraine, given his assessment of his own military. So we can argue as much as anybody wants that we could have handled NATO enlargement differently. But I actually think this was a war of choice invented by Vladimir Putin based on his own rational, but in the end, flawed assessments. So I'm not sure this war could have been avoided.
Well, we will have to leave it there. Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations, author of many books on foreign affairs that you should all read. Thank you so much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? My guest today is worried about how domestic politics can undo America's global standing. It's become a lot harder for the U.S. to have a strategic vision for the world because of extreme polarization. One party comes in and reverses almost everything the other party just did, and countries just aren't sure how to deal with that kind of Washington. On top of that, half of the American people are asking why their country is engaged in the world in the first place, when they'd rather be focusing on problems at home than abroad. So politicians continue to win votes by exploiting threats, whether real or imagined, and push policies that can harm America's interests. Ambassador Haass worries that U.S. foreign policy can be torn down from within. And he is right. And that's the bottom line.